VIU Online presents GEC 101 English Composition Week 4 Theoretical Lecture, Effective Language and Sentence Grammar. This lecture is presented by Dr. Laura Hills, Professor of English at Virginia International University. Our reading this week suggests that normal in writing is subjective. A good starting place is for us to recognize what we consider normal. We have to consider that today, especially because of the internet, we are very often communicating across cultures. We may be communicating across cultures even in a face-to-face classroom, as we have diverse people in our settings everywhere, our workplace, at the university, in our communities. And so there are many things we need to do, beginning with the first tip. Examine your own customary behaviors and assumptions. Very often we aren't even aware that we have customary behaviors and assumptions. But it's important for us to understand that how we communicate in writing is often a result of assumptions and customary behaviors. I know that when I am writing for a diverse audience, or even speaking for a diverse audience, I'm very careful and change my behavior so that I do so in a way that I will be understood by the largest number of people. I speak differently in my home, for instance, than I am in this lecture right now. I'm a lot sloppier in my speech. And so in writing as well, we have to look at what our customary behaviors and assumptions are and figure out what we may need to change to be understood by the broadest number of readers. We have to think about how we may affect what we do affects what we think, say, and write. And we have to listen closely to someone from another culture. That's how I learned a great deal about what I'm assuming and my customary behaviors. How is that person's normal similar, and importantly, how is it different? What does your audience expect? What's normal for them? For instance, right now on this lecture, you have an expectation that I'm going to use certain kinds of visuals, I'm going to speak in a particular way. If I started playing the piano and singing for you, that would break your expectation. Organize your writing with your audience's expectations or normal in mind. And if you are in doubt, always revert to the most formal style. It may not be everyone's favorite, but it will be one that people can understand across culture. You also have to consider your rhetorical stance. And in the United States, students are often asked to establish authority in their writing. Like this fellow who's standing up there on his box giving his opinion. And that is a position that needs to be learned in many cases, not only by students who are from the United States, but those from other countries, other cultures, that when asked to write for academic writing, you are now in the realm of an authority. You're speaking authoritatively. You have to also meet your audience's expectations. What knowledge are you supposed to have? Well, we've already established some things in this course. You're supposed to know how to craft an argument, and you're supposed to know how to present that argument with supporting evidence cited in APA style. Show respect to your reader always and be polite, and also show respect to your sources, even if you disagree with them. Err on the side of formality, always a good rule. Use evidence to support your claims. Use reliable and credible sources. These are all expectations we've spoken about in the previous weeks. Don't assume. Explain yourself. Provide necessary background information. You have to realize that even somebody who has a great deal of knowledge may not know as much about your topic as you do. So you have to provide them with the context and background that they need. You have to write in standard English without those habits of social media creeping in. And you don't want to bore your audience to tears. Does this happen? Every day. I am not only a writer, but I have consumed volumes and volumes and volumes of scholarly work. And unfortunately, a lot of it does bore the reader to tears. But I don't think that's necessary just because you're writing for an academic audience. You can engage your reader and you can be interesting and entertaining. We also want to use language that builds common ground. That means that we cannot afford to offend our reader. And I know it's not your intention to offend, and yet sometimes students do things in their papers that inadvertently do offend at least some readers. Let's take a look. First, you need to avoid stereotypes and generalizations. Stereotypes and generalizations are often based on half-truths, on misunderstandings, and on hand-me-down prejudices, ones you may have learned from someone else. Stereotypes and generalizations lead to intolerance, and in the academy, there is no room for intolerance. Stereotypes and generalizations create an us versus them climate. Again, this is not welcomed in academic writing. Are the terms you use to refer to groups accurate and acceptable? And let me add also up to date, because terms from 20, 30 years ago were perfectly acceptable then, but are offensive now in some cases. You must avoid assumptions about gender. So much of our language is gender specific but does not need to be, and we've seen a shift in that. For example, to revise sexist language, we now use words such as chairperson, salesperson, business person, rather than chairman, salesman, businessman. There's no need to put the man in that. A member of Congress versus a congressman or congresswoman. A firefighter rather than a fireman. Mail carrier rather than a mailman. A secretary, whether it is a male or female, and not to say a male secretary. There's no need unless the point of what you're writing is gender. And a bus driver is not a male bus driver or a woman bus driver, and it's not a woman engineer or a male engineer. There's no need to say what the gender of the person is in describing. Another issue that comes up is this whole problem of trying to be sensitive to men and women in your writing, but not falling into this messy he, she, him, her construction. Let me show you what I mean. Look at this sentence. A lawyer must pass his or her bar exam before he or she can begin to practice. Well, that is a gender-sensitive sentence because we haven't assumed the male, but it's messy. So a good idea in your writing is to be just as sensitive, but to write in a way so that you can eliminate needless he, she, him, her. And here's how you can do it in a case like this one. Let's rewrite it. Well, we can pluralize. Lawyers, plural, must pass the bar exam before they can begin to practice. That is just as gender neutral, but it doesn't fall into that he, she, him, her construct. Let's take another look at how we might have done the same thing. A lawyer, male or female, must pass the bar exam before beginning to practice. Sometimes there's no way out of the he, she, him, her, but when you can avoid it by pluralizing or using a term such as a lawyer, that's the better way to go. It makes for very sensitive language without being clumsy. You also need to avoid assumptions about race and ethnicity. Now, when I was growing up, a term such as colored or Negro was very commonly used in the United States, and it was not considered to be offensive. I remember when the term black just started being used, and now we use the term African American very often. When I was teaching English as a second language some years ago at Virginia International University, I had a student who used the term Negro in his papers, and I discovered that he had been studying out of old textbooks from the 1960s. He did not realize that in the United States we no longer use that term, and so I had to teach him that. You need to stay up with what the ways are of today. Let's look at the second example. I used to say an Indian when I was a child. We called the native population of the United States Indians. But today that is not the term that we use. Very often the term Native American is used, but even more so, today we're more likely to name the particular tribe, Chippewa, Navajo, Pueblo, etc. Same with Eskimo, a term that was commonly used. We more often use the term Inuit, which is a tribal term. The word Oriental has undergone a change in my lifetime. When I was a child, I remember people were referred to as Oriental. Today, we do not use that term to refer to people, only to objects, and we call the people Asian. And we're very sensitive today not to lump people together, but to use terms such as Mexican American or Puerto Rican to be specific and accurate. We also want to avoid ageism in our writing. And this is something that people have less awareness of, but I think it's very, very important. Let's look at some examples. When we write of people who are older, we have often seen words like describing someone as spry, as chipper, well-preserved, matronly, grandmotherly, little or old, or we might say, oh, well, she's still driving, to indicate that the assumption is that by her age or his age, we would not expect the person to be able to do so. So be sensitive not to let such ageist descriptions fall into your writing. We also have moved away from describing people with disabilities as victims. I remember hearing terms like she was stricken with polio or a victim. So now we say a person with AIDS, not an AIDS victim. We say a person who uses a wheelchair, not a person who is wheelchair bound. And we say a person with diabetes rather than a diabetic. That dehumanizes a person to say he's a diabetic. He's a person first with diabetes. We have much more sensitive language, all having to do with illnesses and disabilities. Readers may discriminate against those who fail to use an expected variety of English. I assure you, if you wrote a paper that was brilliant, but you put the term Negro in there just to describe a person of color, it would not make the reader's opinion of you any better, and it would probably hurt a great deal. We also have to be aware that we are writing for academic audiences, and so that means formality and following the conventions of APA citation. The exception is if you are asked to write something that is inherently less formal, such as a blog post. We want writing sometimes, however, to evoke a place or a community. We talked about writing for a large, diverse audience, but sometimes you're writing for a very specific audience of a select group of people. If that is the case, there are certain things that you can do. One is to use words from other languages that would be known specifically to your readers. Another would be to use colloquialisms familiar to the people specifically that you're writing for. A third would be to use dialects. There are many authors who create characters in their works of fiction who speak in particular dialects because those are known to the reader. And you can use even special words that are particular to a place. I'll give you a really good example. For some years in my career, I was living in a state in the United States called Wisconsin. It's in the central northern part of the United States. And I lived in a town called Madison, which was the capital city. I was not from this region. I was from New York. And I discovered that there was a term used there that I had never heard anywhere else, that a water fountain was called a bubbler. And so I remember there was an issue in the office building where I worked where the water fountains were not working, and a memo was issued that said the bubblers are out of service. Of course, being a New Yorker, I had no idea what we were talking about. But that does evoke a sense of place or community if everyone there does indeed know that a bubbler is a water fountain. So sometimes, not in most academic writing, but in some kinds of writing that you do, you may purposefully use special words, dialects, colloquialisms, or words from other languages to create a bond with your reader. You also may use slang. Again, not in academic contexts, but in others. You also may find as you enter the workforce that there is particular jargon, technical, and occupational language that people who work in your field know, but others do not. When writing for an audience specifically that knows this language, then it is permissible to use it, but not for a more diverse audience. Always we want to avoid pompous language. Let me show you a really good example. On the left, this is a very pompous way of writing. Pursuant to the August 9th memorandum regarding petroleum supply exigencies, it is incumbent upon us to endeavor to make maximal utilization of telephonic communication in lieu of personal visitation. Well, first of all, it's hard to figure out what that is, but it is unnecessarily fancy and big, highfalutin words. Let's look at a better way to write the same thing. As noted in the August 9th memo, please make telephone calls rather than personal visits whenever possible because of the gasoline shortage. Now, why do people write in the pompous way? I believe it's because they're trying to show how smart they are. But no matter how smart you are, there's no need to do that, and it is not good writing. Good writing is able to reach your audience and be clearly understood. So get rid of the fancy stuff and just say it simply and accurately. You also want to avoid euphemisms when you can. Now, in certain situations, because of bad news or something you're trying to convince someone of, you do use euphemisms, but don't do so needlessly. What do I mean? On the left are the euphemisms, and on the right is what we really mean. So the plus size is a really nice euphemism for being overweight or fat, passing away for dying. It's very lovely to say your position is being eliminated rather than you're fired or you're laid off. And it is very sensitive to say he's between jobs rather than he's unemployed, or I've been held up instead of I'm going to be late, pre-owned car versus used car, and vintage rather than old or secondhand. Use the euphemism very carefully. I am not saying to you that you never use them. You do, but make intelligent choices about when you use them. Sometimes you do, and sometimes it is far better to say it the way it really is. Avoid doublespeak and gobbledygook. What's gobbledygook? Well, it's when a person says, don't try to hide the truth from me. Don't tell me you're undergoing, quote, employee repositioning. Tell me I'm out of a job. And don't call the unpaid time off you're forcing on me a furlough. Call it unpaid time off. In other words, don't dress it up. Don't say it in all this highfalutin language. Say it the way it really is. One way that you can make your language richer is to use similes, and I'm guessing many of you have already encountered these in English instruction prior to this course, but as a quick review, let's look at what we mean. A simile is an expression used where you liken one thing to another. So here are some lovely ones. Rain slides slowly down the glass as if the night is crying. That's a little bit poetic even. It moved easily like a hot knife through butter, like a candle in the wind, as Sir Elton John had written a beautiful song. I feel as though I'm a young bride again. He cried like a baby. It's as if he's going to have a root canal. It's a wonderful feeling, like the first day of a long vacation. She's as sweet as candy. It's like a trip down memory lane. We've seen these before. And it's as loud as thunder. All of these are great ways to connect something new to something the reader already knows. Metaphors are very similar to similes, except we don't make the comparison clearly. We say the thing is the thing. It's not actually literal. We don't mean it, but it's another way to make the same kind of comparison. The internet is the new town square, something I read recently. I've got the world on a string. That was a song from earlier in the 1900s. She's the cat's meow, an old expression. You're the cream in my coffee. Not literally, but it's a way I'm expressing something about you. He's as stubborn as a mule. She's an angel. I was swimming in a sea of grief. His heart is broken. She's the light of my life, the apple of my eye. She reeks of the stench of failure. I love that one. And his room is a disaster area. Not literally, but we're making a comparison. We're just not clearly saying it is a comparison. We don't say his heart is like it's broken. We're saying it is broken. Now, analogies are very powerful. And here's one that illustrates a concept from history. 125th Street was to Harlem what the Mississippi River was to the American South. A long traveling river, always going somewhere, carrying something. This is an interesting way to compare two things, to create an analogy. We are all, in our whatever language we come to English from, whether we're native to it or not, we learn cliches, and they're wonderful, but they make your writing, well, frankly, less interesting and predictable. And here are a whole bunch of cliches. Busy as a bee, children are our future, pretty as a picture in a jiffy, I had the time of my life, he's as old as the hills, fit as a fiddle, it's like he has no care in the world, opposites attract, there are plenty of fish in the sea, the pot calling the kettle black, dead as a doornail, low-hanging fruit for easy things to get. Every cloud is a silver lining, haste makes waste, what goes around comes around, I was scared out of my wits, all's well that ends well, it's a matter of time, he did it in the nick of time, if only walls could talk, they were as thick as thieves, every dog has its day, I felt like a kid in a candy store, or this one which has been just used to death, thinking outside the box. If you are tempted to use a cliche such as any of these or the many, many others that are out there, it's okay, put it down, and then see if you can find a better, more original way to express the same thought. This is what takes good writing to great writing. When you don't use the predictable way of expressing ideas, but you present some new way of doing it. Allusions are very interesting, but they'll work only if your audience recognizes them. You're alluding to some other knowledge. And here's a good example. If they have an Achilles heel, it is their inexperience and youth. Now, this is an allusion to Achilles and his heel, but if you never heard of Achilles and don't know that it was his heel that was his weakness that ended being tragic for him, then this wouldn't mean anything. So you have to use allusions only if your audience will recognize them, and when you're working across cultures, you have to be very careful, because what is commonly known in your world, the assumptions you make, the lens through which you look at things is not everyone's. This concludes the theoretical lecture for week 4.